Hey, it is Damien, aka Sleepy Book Reader, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the last audiobook I finished, which was Remain in Love by Chris Frantz. It's a rock autobiography. Chris Frantz was the drummer in the Talking Heads and the drummer in the Tom Tom Club. He and his wife also produced a lot of albums, Ziggy Marley and a bunch of other things. I can't remember them all right now. Tina Weymouth, his wife, was the bass player in the Talking Heads. And of course, David Byrne is the famous frontman for the Talking Heads. And the three of them were kind of the musical unit that formed the Talking Heads. And then just as they recorded their first album, they added Jerry Harrison, the keyboard and second guitarist, to it. So I found this to be a very enjoyable rock autobiography, and pretty different from your average biography or autobiography of rock stars. I mean, I've listened to a lot of them, like Steven Tyler and Keith Richards and Sammy Hagar and a bunch of others. And like most of those guys, Chris Frantz reads it himself, and it's nice hearing it in his voice. And so I learned a lot about the Talking Heads that I really didn't know. And I also had a feeling of time travel back to a time when I was young and very interested in music. From the late 70s to in the early 80s, near the end of my high school career and then my college years, the Talking Heads really figured quite large in all of that, and the whole scene they came out of. So, they're just different characters come in and out of the story who were all sort of part of what seemed like a important cultural moment to me at the time, from David Johansen and Patti Smith to Ian Dury and members of XTC and all kinds of other things like that, Brian Eno. And so it was all like ringing these bells of things that seemed really important to me, when I was maybe 17 through 22 or so. So that made this particularly interesting, and I listened to a lot of Talking Heads music after finishing the book, and it brought me back. Fear of Music, the Talking Heads, I think, third album, was kind of a major album for me at some point. But things go so quickly when you're that age. I had so many major albums at so many times, and several of them were Talking Heads albums. And others were albums by other friends of theirs. And so, like all autobiographies, you kind of want to skip to the good part. His early life is interesting enough, but he's kind of a rich, preppy kid, basically, but in the 1960s, so there was a lot more drugs involved than you think of for the rich, preppy kids. Although I would argue from the rich, preppy kids I knew when I was younger, that drugs played a big part, at least in the 70s, in late 70s, that I was familiar with. But yeah, so I was unclear, I don't think Tina Weymouth indulged as much as he did, and I was unclear if David Byrne, the sort of frontman of the Talking Heads and the really famous one, if he was as involved in drugs either. Because at one point this is kind of a sticking point for me. At one point he talks about the era where they did the famous movie Stop Making Sense, that tour, and he says they were all high on cocaine during those concerts. And I somehow was a little disappointed to hear that. And on a larger scale, when I got into the new wave and punk in the late 70s, it was an antidote to, or it seemed to be an antidote to the hippie era. And so I didn't really expect them to be doing drugs the way the rest of the rock stars were. But like I said, he was prep schools in the 60s and then college in the 60s, they were all doing a lot of drugs anyway, I suppose. But yeah, so that was a little revelation to me. I probably should have known that already. I mean, like, I long ago learned about all kinds of drug excesses from other people from the new wave and punk movements. But the real interesting dynamic here is the relationship between, as presented by Chris Frantz, the relationship between him and his wife, and then sort of at the edge of things, their relationship with David Byrne. And that's kind of the fascinating part that feels like some of the puzzle is missing. Like, at first, he's not saying bad things about David Byrne, but he's working his way up to it. So he makes kind of clear that most, if not all of their music was done in collaboration, but they didn't always get credit for it. Almost all the early songs and many of the later songs came out of jam sessions that they were all doing, extensively over long periods of time. It also made clear to me how much hard work went into a band like the Talking Heads. When I was a kid and they first came out, it was like, oh, you can just get up there and make something up yourself that's completely original. And of course, I now realize all the elements that went into their music, that they had their inspirations. They didn't just pull it out of a hat. And in fact, the stuff he mentions confirms my suspicions, not just about James Brown and stuff, but they were listening to Nigerian music early on and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, the fascinating thing in the end is this relationship with David Byrne. And it's very disappointing to them. They feel kind of deserted by their friend. And maybe there's a bit of, we stuck with this guy, but then he didn't stick with us. And he doesn't say it explicitly, but David Byrne was probably this really weird guy. We would now call him, somewhere on the autistic spectrum. Back then, the term autism was saved for more extreme cases. But it might have been, but I'm reading between the lines, it might have been that it was hard for him to connect with many people, but Chris Frantz in particular and Tina Weymouth came along for the ride eventually, were kind of his support and people who believed in him and would not reject him for his strange behavior and that sort of thing. But I'm only guessing. But then in the end, they are burnt by that because he doesn't have at least from their point of view, he doesn't have the loyalties and the emotional connections that they do. On the other hand, I don't know his side of the story. And while the music may have all come out of jamming, David Byrne's done a lot of good solo work too. And he was the front man. He was singing. He was playing the guitar. He was a huge part of the sound. The other, the flip side might be they were lucky to attach themselves to David Byrne. It's probably definitely, much more in the middle, I would guess. But all of that kind of fascinated me. He does, in the book, he mentions that his wife, that Tina's off in another room working on her book, but I couldn't find her book anywhere. So I wonder if there's a book coming out from her or if she gave up on that, because I would love to hear a slightly different version of this same story. And like I said, to me, the Talking Heads are such a central cultural moment, a central group in the changing of music and the taking of the making of pop rock and roll into something that it never was before, that there was kind of this avant-gardeness. And how much of that has to do with David Byrne's weirdness and how much it has to do with all of them coming out of art school and all of that is interesting. And I kind of wish that the one thing that I wished for more of, the theme of the book was that he remains in love with his wife, and it was all a love letter to his wife, and that was very nice, very touching. I kind of wanted him to reflect on that a little more at the end of the book. I mean, he comes back to it as a theme, but he doesn't quite dig deep enough. And that's always my problem with autobiographies and even biographies, but I always want them to dig a little deeper into certain things that have caught my attention. So that's selfish of me. But I have huge respect for David Byrne. I've already kind of indicated that, but like one of my favorite books is David Byrne's book on music. So he's certainly, it's not that he hasn't thought a lot about music. That is really, truly his love. And it was a fascinating book, David book. I think it's called On Music or What Makes Music. I'll have to look that up. I think I have that on audiobook too. I think I've read that in the book form and listened to it in the audiobook, and David Byrne reads that. I don't think David Byrne would ever write this kind of book looking back on his life, but I do want to relook at his book on music now that I've heard Chris Franz's point of view on all of this. I wonder if, Brian Eno was very involved in all this. I need to look and see if Brian Eno has written a book, because that would also be very interesting. Anyway, I guess my final, another weird thing about listening to an autobiography or a biography is in a few hours, like this was 15 hours, in 15 hours, you get, in your mind as a reader, you get like an entire life rushing by. And that also, I guess that, given that this struck a chord with me in terms of times of my life, made me feel like, oh my God, life is almost over. or that, or also just that overwhelmed feeling. And also, I haven't done as much with my life as these people have. What was wrong? Wish I could go back in time and be more intense or something. That's another thing that I wonder sometimes when I read about people in groups or other people who've done creative things in collaboration, like how many of us might have achieved something differently if we had the right collaborator, if we had run into the right person. There's a whole lot of right time, right place stuff in here. For instance, these three friends from college moved to New York City, and the only place they can afford to live is Bleecker Street. And they do have in David Byrne and Chris Franz, not Tina Weymouth, have in mind that they're going to pursue music for a while. But it just so happens, they didn't know about it, they're 3 blocks away from CBGB's, where a whole new music scene is starting, a place where you can go and do really weird music. And so if they hadn't happened to move there at that time, what would it be, like 1973, 74? If they hadn't moved there at that time and happened to get an apartment so close to the club that they accidentally discovered it, who knows what would happen? Now I've got to take something out of the oven. So I guess that's a thing an imponderable that I ponder about, right time, right place, who you meet. Who did I meet that I could have collaborated with that I didn't, perhaps? Maybe some of us go through life not thinking about collaborating with people. And maybe that's a flaw. Anyway, I'll hopefully be back pretty soon and talk to you all later.